Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book, Season 06, Episode 36. Today, we delved into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, to unpack the profound journey of the Labour Party from its post-1979 electoral wilderness to Tony Blair's transformative decade in Downing Street and the complex legacy he left behind.
It's a really fascinating period, isn't it? Seeing a party almost fall apart and then, well, completely reshape itself.
Absolutely. And Lowe's book gives us a great lens on that. It was a pivotal era full of these surprising shifts and changes. We'll dig into the debates that, still resonate today. So, yeah, let's get into it.
Definitely. What's so interesting is how Labour had to basically rethink everything, its whole identity, just to survive politically after '79.
That really kicked off after the big defeat in the 1979 election. James Callaghan steps down in 1980, and suddenly the party's facing this huge identity crisis. What was the core problem, the dilemma they were grappling with?
Well, it was a pretty stark choice, really. Do they go further left, really double down on the old socialist ideas? Or do they pivot, maybe even adopt some tougher policies, things like curbing union power, which would have been, well, unthinkable for their traditional base?
And initially it was the left that gained ground, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. That tendency really took hold for a bit.
Which led to what some people pretty brutally called a suicide note, that 1983 manifesto.
Oh, absolutely. It was famously called the most radical ever. Total nationalization, pulling out of the European community, getting rid of nuclear weapons unilaterally, even abolishing the House of Lords.
Wow, that sounds extreme.
It was, and it was heavily influenced by groups like the Militant Tendency, these Trotskyite groups that had sort of infiltrated local parties. The result, a complete disaster in the election, just 209 seats.
Ouch. Compared to the Conservatives' 397.
Exactly. It sent a very, very clear message. This path just wasn't working. They couldn't win like that.
So, okay, 83 is a watershed moment, a clear need for change. What was the sort of first big step in that new direction? Who led that charge?
That really starts with Neil Kinnock. Michael Foot resigns, Kinnock comes in. And Kinnock, even though he came from the left himself, he was pragmatic. He saw the 83 manifesto, knew it was electoral poison.
Right.
He understood they needed radical reform to have any hope of winning again. So he started, fairly quietly at first, dropping those really extreme ideas, renationalization, EC withdrawal, that kind of thing.
But he also took a very public stand against militant, didn't he? That sounds like a massive risk for a leader at the time.
Oh, it was huge. That speech in October 1986, that was a real turning point. He just went for them head on, talked about the grotesque chaos in Liverpool, where militants' policies led them to, well, basically try and manufacture a crisis by sending redundancy notices to thousands of council workers.
Trying to force the government's hand?
Exactly. And Kinnock just ripped into them, saying their implausible promises don't win victories. It was powerful stuff. It helped draw a line between the sort of soft left and the real hardliners, and it massively boosted his own authority in the party. Risky, yes, but absolutely necessary.
Fascinating. And then over the next, 5 years or so, he pushed through some pretty fundamental changes to the party structure itself.
He did, yeah. Centralizing control was key. He set up this policy review group, gave the NEC, that's the National Executive Committee, control over choosing candidates for by-elections. And crucially, he brought in the one-member, one-vote principle, OMOV, for NEC elections.
Why was OMOV so important?
Because he realized individual party members were generally more moderate than some of the activists who dominated the old structures. Then came the big policy review in '89, meet the challenge, make the change. And that basically accepted Thatcherite free market thinking.
A huge shift.
Massive. So after all that groundwork, everyone thought, right, 1992, this is Labour's time.
But it wasn't. John Major pulled off that surprise win for the Conservatives. That must have been utterly crushing for Labour.
Oh, absolutely devastating. All that work and still losing. Kinnock was heartbroken, resigned almost immediately, and John Smith, who'd been shadow chancellor, took over.
Smith was seen as more moderate, right? A Scottish lawyer.
Yes, very much so. He continued the modernization process. He even managed to extend OMOV to the party conference itself for policymaking, which was a big fight, especially with some unions. And Labour's popularity did start to bounce back. They did really well in the European Parliament elections. He looked like a prime minister in waiting.
And then, just as things looked promising, tragedy. John Smith's sudden death in May '94. What happened then? That must have thrown everything up in the air again.
It really did. He was only 53. His death suddenly opened the field. Gordon Brown, the shadow chancellor, was, the widely presumed successor. Everyone expected him to take over.
But someone else emerged.
Exactly. Tony Blair. Young, charismatic, the shadow home secretary. Suddenly, he starts overtaking Brown in the opinion polls among party members and the public.
Okay. And this leads us to that famous, or perhaps infamous, deal between Blair and Brown, the Grenada Pact, some call it.
That's the one. The details are debated, but the outcome was clear. Brown stepped aside, didn't stand against Blair, allowing Blair to win the leadership pretty easily.
And once Blair was litter, what was the driving force? What did he and Brown agree needed to happen next?
They both fundamentally believed that the modernization Kinnock and Smith started hadn't gone nearly far enough. The party, they thought, still carried this sort of socialist taint that put off voters. They needed to make a much cleaner break.
Which led to maybe the most symbolic moment of all, the abolition of Clause 4.
Absolutely. Getting rid of Clause 4 of the party's 1918 Constitution in 1995, that was a monumental.
Remind us, what exactly was Clause 4? Why was ditching it such a big deal?
Clause 4 was the historical commitment to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. Basically, the pledge to nationalize industry.
So getting rid of it was?
It was genuinely the end of an era, as Lowe puts it. It signaled the definitive shift from old labor to new labor, a move away from traditional socialism towards something more like social democracy. It was incredibly bold, very pragmatic. It removed a huge ideological weapon the conservatives constantly used against them.
Okay, so Clause 4 is gone. The path is clear to really remake the party's image for the upcoming 97 election.
Yeah.
How did they position this new labor? What was the strategy?
They talked about finding a third way, something between, old-style socialism and the kind of unrestrained capitalism associated with Thatcher. The idea was to embrace the market, embrace enterprise, but still focus on tackling inequality, tackling poverty.
And who were they trying to reach?
Crucially, the middle class. The old industrial working class base was shrinking. They knew they had to win over aspirational voters, homeowners, people in the service sector. This meant a real strategic shift. Blair even famously charmed media barons like Rupert Murdoch. Suddenly, the Sun newspaper, the Evening Standard, they're backing labor.
That must have shocked some traditionalists.
Yeah.
Andrew Marr called Blair the playful magician of political life. He even praised Thatcher sometimes.
He did, which, as you can imagine, caused some serious consternation among the old guard. They looked on in silent, helpless disbelief, according to Lowe.
But what's really interesting looking back is how relatively modest the actual manifesto promises were in 97 after all that rebranding. Yeah. What does that tell you?
It tells you they were playing it incredibly safe. They were terrified of frightening the voters. The key pledges were things like cutting primary school class sizes, speeding up punishment for young offenders, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, cutting NHS waiting lists, getting young people into jobs through a windfall tax on privatized utilities.
And crucially, tax.
Crucially, no income tax rises. Keep inflation low. And this was key, not canceling Thatcher's trade union reforms. It was all designed to signal competence, reassurance, no radical shocks. We're sensible now.
And boy, did it work. A landslide victory in 97, 418 seats for Labor, their highest total ever. Which brings us back to that debate. How much was it Labor's clever transformation, and how much was it just that people were fed up with the conservatives?
Yeah, it's a perennial question, isn't it? Lowe suggests, and most observers agree, it was probably a bit of both. Labor had undoubtedly made themselves electable again, shedding the image that lost them elections for nearly 2 decades. But the conservatives were also exhausted, divided, especially over Europe, and seemed accident-prone. Labor presented a fresh alternative, and the Tories looked tired.
So New Labor sweeps into power. And almost immediately you get that quite striking comment attributed to Margaret Thatcher herself that her legacy would be safe in his hands, talking about Blair. That really begs the question, was New Labor just Thatcherism with a friendlier face? What were the similarities?
Well, there were definitely some striking parallels, especially early on. Like Thatcher, Blair could seem like an outsider in his own party sometimes, pulling it towards the center, or center-right even.
How so?
Both relied quite heavily on unelected advisors, spin doctors. Both weren't afraid to bypass the formal cabinet structure. Cabinet meetings under Blair apparently became very short, sometimes less than an hour. Decision-making happened elsewhere.
And economically?
Economically, too, particularly in those first couple of years. Both leaders believed in the power of market forces, global free trade. Gordon Brown, as chancellor, made a huge effort to reassure the city, keep big business happy, and famously, he stuck to the spending plans inherited from the conservatives for the first 2 years.
Right, that caused some controversy on the left.
It did, and they even continued some privatization, like parts of air traffic control. So you can see why Thatcher might have felt a certain continuity.
Okay, so there are those parallels. But it can't just have been a repackaging exercise. What were the fundamental differences between Blair's New Labour and Thatcher's conservatism?
Oh, the differences were profound. Firstly, style and approach. Thatcher thrived on confrontation. Blair actively sought consensus, wanted to unite the country, and crucially, their underlying motivation.
Which was?
Both Blair and Brown were driven by a kind of Christian socialist ethic, a genuine desire to help the disadvantaged, narrow that gap between rich and poor. Blair had that famous quote, "I am my brother's keeper." That belief fueled their commitment to improving public services, the NHS, education, tackling poverty and unemployment. That was very different from the Thatcherite focus.
In Europe, devolution.
Big differences there, too. Blair wanted Britain to play a leading role in Europe, unlike Thatcher's increasing Euroscepticism. And he strongly supported devolution, creating the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, restoring power sharing in Northern Ireland, plus reforming the House of Lords. These were major constitutional changes unthinkable under Thatcher. So, yes, a very different vision underneath the market-friendly surface.
And that difference was clear very early on. Gordon Brown's first big move, just days into office, giving the Bank of England independence over setting interest rates. That wasn't just popular, it was a huge signal, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It shouted economic competence and stability to the markets and the public. It was a masterstroke politically. And on Europe, as you mentioned, they immediately signed the Amsterdam Treaty, accepted the social chapter, which Major had opted out of. They didn't join the Euro Brown, the famous 5 economic tests, saw to that, but the tone towards the EU was much more positive.
Then there was that unexpected national moment, the death of Princess Diana in August '97. Blair's handling of that seemed to show a different kind of leadership, too.
It really did. He tapped into the public mood perfectly, calling her the people's princess in that TV tribute. It resonated hugely. And apparently, he played a key role behind the scenes in persuading the Queen to agree to the public funeral at Westminster Abbey. Lowe suggests this potentially saved the royal family's reputation at a really difficult time. It showed Blair's knack for understanding and responding to public feeling.
Beyond those high-profile moments, what other big domestic policy wins did they notch up in that first term?
Well, a massive one was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland in April '98. A truly historic breakthrough, even if the path ahead was still difficult. Then you had the Crime and Disorder Act, bringing in ASBO's antisocial behavior orders. That reflected their tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime mantra, although the long-term effectiveness of ASBOs is definitely debatable.
Get on rights.
Big steps there, too. The Human Rights Act in '98, incorporating the European Convention into UK law. The Freedom of Information Act followed, and anti-discrimination laws. And, of course, one of the absolute landmark achievements, the introduction of the national minimum wage in April 1999.
That was hugely controversial at the time, wasn't it? Predictions of economic doom.
Oh, yes. Conservatives predicted mass unemployment, soaring inflation, but it didn't happen. It was introduced smoothly, starting at £3.60 an hour, and it successfully boosted the incomes of the lowest paid without those negative effects. In fact, it was so successful the Conservatives eventually accepted it.
And they were getting people into work, too.
Yes, the New Deal program for young unemployed people was credited with moving about 200,000 into work by 2001. And then, delivering on devolution, the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly opened in 1999. They even started reforming the House of Lords, getting rid of most of the hereditary peers in 2000, though what came next wasn't quite decided. Oh, and abroad, Blair showed that liberal interventionist streak early on, using military force in Kosovo and Sierra Leone, arguing it was justified to remove dictators.
So quite a packed and, in many ways, successful first term. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were definitely problems and failures that started to emerge, things that maybe sowed the seeds for later difficulties. What were some of those early issues?
One big one was fiscal constraint. Brown's pledge to stick to Tory spending plans for 2 years meant some really unpopular decisions early on, like cuts to benefits for single parents in late '97. Tony Blair made that famous protest, you cannot justify taking money off the poorest.
Right, and Brown's stealth taxes.
Exactly. Freezing tax thresholds so more people got dragged into higher bands, raising stamp duty, national insurance, and the really controversial one removing the tax credits on dividends paid to pension funds.
That had a huge impact down the line, didn't it?
Its exact impact is debated, but many argue it did have a disastrous effect on pension values over time. Now, Brown used the extra revenue, about £37 billion, to pay down public debt, which helped the economy long term, but it meant less money for immediate improvements in schools and hospitals, which people had hoped for.
And there were promises that weren't kept, which always annoys voters. And that growing reputation for spin and sleaze, what sort of things fueled that?
Well, John Prescott's big ambitions for public transport never really got the funding from the Treasury, and introducing tuition fees for university students was a major U-turn, coming just a year after they'd promised not to. That damaged trust.
And the sleaze accusations.
Yeah, things like the Formula One tobacco advertising affair giving F1 an exemption after Bernie Ecclestone donated £1 million to labor. It just looked bad. Then Peter Mandelson had to resign twice, once over an undeclared home loan from Jeffrey Robinson, another minister who also had to go. There were other incidents too, questions about party funding, even involving Blair himself. It all chipped away at that initial whiter-than-white image.
And we can't forget the Millennium Dome. That became quite the symbol, didn't it?
Oh, the dome. Cost £1 billion, huge controversy. Andrew Marr's description stuck. A theme park without a theme. It just became this sort of embarrassing symbol of perhaps style over substance, grand projects maybe not quite delivering.
And another policy that started then but became much more significant later, the Private Finance Initiative, PFI.
Yes, using private companies to build and run hospitals, schools, infrastructure. It allowed the government to keep the massive building costs off the immediate balance sheet, but it meant locking future governments into long, expensive rental contracts. Ross McKibben made that point. Should private profit really be made from core public services? These PFI deals often proved inflexible and more expensive in the long run.
Plus, remember the fuel protests in September 2000? Lorry drivers blockading refineries over high fuel taxes. That really shook the government.
It did. Lowe says it pushed them on the verge of panic. Shortages, queues at petrol stations. It was a real crisis. So, despite all those earlier successes, by 2001, there were definitely some dents in the new labor armor.
Yet, despite all that, the stealth taxes, the spin, the dome, the fuel crisis, they still won the 2001 election quite comfortably, didn't they? Another big majority, though slightly reduced. How did they manage that?
It's interesting, isn't it? One thing Lowe points out is the voter turnout, it dropped massively, down to just 60%. Labor claimed this was because people were basically content, saw no need to change.
But others had a different take.
Yeah, others argued it was because voters saw little real choice between the main parties anymore, that Labor had become so neo-Thatcherite, as some put it, that there wasn't much difference. But look, the government could point to genuine achievements.
Like the minimum wage.
Exactly. Minimum wage, higher pensions, tax credits, these things had made a real difference to poorer families. And while schools and the NHS hadn't been miraculously transformed, their decline had definitely been halted. Brown promising huge extra investment in the NHS just before the election probably helped too.
And Blair's style, that consensus approach.
That played a part too. Bringing in figures from other parties, Patty Ashdown, Ken Clark, Michael Heseltine to work on specific projects. It seemed like a refreshing change from the confrontational politics of the Thatcher years.
And the opposition.
Crucially, the Conservatives were still in a mess. Weak, divided, especially over Europe. William Hague, their leader, seemed to focus almost entirely on saving the pound during the campaign, which made them look out of touch with people's main concerns about public services. So even if some voters felt a bit let down by Labor's first term, the alternative just didn't look credible. That's often the key in politics, isn't it? The weakness of the opposition.
Absolutely. So Blair wins his second term. And just 3 months later, September 11, 2001, everything changes. The focus shifts dramatically to foreign affairs, the war on terror. How did Blair react to 9/11?
His response was immediate and very decisive. He pledged full support for the U.S. straight away, famously flew to Washington, attended that emergency session of Congress. The only foreign leader there got a standing ovation. He really threw himself into the role of, as Lowe calls him, ambassador at large for the coalition against terror.
Traveling constantly.
Well, constantly. Over 40,000 miles, 54 meetings with world leaders, building support for action against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Even Claire Short, who often criticized him later, called this period Tony's best moment. He seemed to rise to the occasion.
And the initial military action in Afghanistan was successful, wasn't it? The Taliban were overthrown relatively quickly by late 2001. Blair's popularity soared.
It did. But then quite quickly, the focus shifted away from Afghanistan towards Iraq and Saddam Hussein. This is where things get much, much more complex and controversial. What was driving Blair towards Iraq, and how did his reasons differ from President Bush's?
That's the crucial question.
Blair's motives seem to have been deeply rooted in his own worldview. He saw 9/11 as this huge moment, a chance not just to fight terrorism, but to reshape the world, tackle global poverty, promote democracy. He had this strong sense of Christian moralism, a belief in liberal interventionism, that using force could be justified to remove brutal dictators.
So a moral imperative for him.
It seems so. He apparently genuinely believed Saddam Hussein was close to getting nuclear weapons and was supporting terrorists. He told Patty Ashdown the intelligence was pretty scary. He felt Saddam couldn't be allowed to get away with it. He connected fighting the war with giving aid, trying to build a better world afterwards.
But Bush and his team, they had different priorities.
That's what Lowe argues. For Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, the neoconservatives, the main goal seems to have been control of Iraq's oil reserves, post-war reconstruction, building democracy. That wasn't really their focus in the same way it was for Blair. Blair wanted justice and prosperity for the dispossessed, as Lowe puts it.
So Blair wasn't just a poodle following Bush.
No, Lowe is clear on that. Blair believed Britain had to play its part in removing Saddam, but, and this was critical for him, he wanted it done with UN approval. That became the sticking point.
Because getting UN backing for Iraq was much harder than for Afghanistan, wasn't it? No clear link between Saddam and al-Qaeda could be proven.
Exactly. So the whole justification shifted onto weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. To convince everyone, the UN, the British public, his own party, Blair's government, produced that famous dossier in September 2002.
The one with the 45-minute claim.
That's the one. Claiming Saddam could deploy WMDs in 45 minutes. That helped get UN Resolution 1441 passed, which demanded Saddam cooperate with weapons inspectors. But it didn't authorize military force. Blair then pushed hard for a second resolution in early 2003 to explicitly authorize war.
But by then, public opinion in Britain was turning sharply against the war.
Massively. That huge demonstration in London in February 2003, maybe 1 million people, and internationally, key countries like France, Russia, China were saying, no, give the inspectors more time. France eventually threatened to use its veto at the UN Security Council, effectively blocking that second resolution Blair desperately wanted.
Which put Blair in a really difficult position. No clear UN mandate. What happened then?
It led to one of the most dramatic moments in Parliament. Robin Cook's resignation speech in March 2003. Cook, the former foreign secretary, laid out why he couldn't support a war without international agreement or broad public backing. He questioned if Saddam was really a clear and present danger to Britain.
He got a standing ovation for that, didn't he? Which is very rare.
Extremely rare. It showed the depth of feeling. But Blair pressed ahead. He managed to win the vote in Parliament to authorize war, but only thanks to conservative support. Over 100 Labour MPs rebelled, a huge split in his own party.
The war itself, militarily, was quick. Baghdad fell in April 2003. Saddam was captured later. Bush declared mission accomplished in May. But the aftermath, that was a different story.
Utterly different. The peace, as Lowe puts it, was disastrous. There was just no proper plan for what came next. Iraqi resentment against the occupation grew rapidly. Soon you had armed resistance, terrorist attacks, sectarian violence spiraling into full-blown civil war by 2008. Ordinary Iraqis found their lives were actually more dangerous than under Saddam.
And the central justification for the war, the WMDs, they were never found.
Never. Not a trace. Which completely demolished Blair's main argument and severely damaged his credibility.
Then came the whole dodgy dossier scandal. The BBC report, Andrew Gilligan, Dr. David Kelly's suicide.
That whole affair was incredibly damaging. Gilligan claimed Downing Street had sexed up the intelligence dossier, particularly that 45-minute claim. The ensuing row, Kelly's tragic death, the Hutton inquiry. Even though Hutton largely cleared the government of deliberately falsifying intelligence, it definitely sowed the seeds of doubt about Blair's honesty. That's when the Blair nickname really took hold.
And didn't one of the U.S. officials accidentally let slip the real motive?
Yes. Paul Wolfowitz, a key Bush advisor, kind of admitted later that the decision was made for reasons related to oil and regional stability, not primarily WMDs, which just fueled the cynicism.
It sounds like the American planning for post-war Iraq was just terrible.
Frighteningly inept is Lowe's phrase. They disbanded the Iraqi army, leaving thousands of trained soldiers unemployed and angry. They failed to maintain law and order. The borders weren't sealed. Their focus seemed to be on privatizing the oil industry rather than basic security or services. All this fueled the insurgency. And Blair, despite being the main ally, seemed to have very little influence over Bush's inner circle on how the occupation was run.
And the consequences went far beyond Iraq itself.
Tragically, yes. Instead of reducing terrorism, the war massively increased it. Al-Qaeda was strengthened, gained a new recruiting ground. We saw horrific attacks linked to the war, like the Madrid train bombings in 2004 and the London 77 bombings in 2005, carried out by British citizens protesting foreign policy.
Plus the damage to the West's reputation from things like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay.
Exactly. The human rights abuses badly discredited the U.S. and its allies. And the underlying issue, the unresolved Israel-Palestine conflict, which many saw as a root cause of terrorism, remained ignored. By the time Blair left office, Iraq was seen by almost everyone, including most of his own former cabinet, as a complete disaster. And Afghanistan wasn't looking much better either. The shadow of Iraq really came to define Blair's legacy for many people.
It's easy to forget, though, that amidst all the intense focus on Iraq and the war on terror, the government was still pursuing its domestic agenda during that second term. What were the key developments on the home front?
That's a really important point. They didn't just stop governing domestically. The NHS saw huge investment. The budget basically tripled from when they came in, up to over $92 billion by 2006. That paid for hundreds of thousands of extra staff. Waiting lists did come down. Death rates for things like cancer and heart disease fell. So real improvements.
But there were criticisms, too.
Yes. Blair became quite focused on introducing choice and competition into the NHS using private providers. Critics argued this undermined the principle of a universal service and didn't necessarily improve quality. And there were growing concerns about hospital infections like MRSA, sometimes linked to privatized cleaning contracts.
And education. Still education, education, education.
Still a massive priority. Spending per pupil doubled again. Tens of thousands more teachers and support staff. GCSE results continued to improve. More young people went to university, although the introduction of tuition fees remained controversial.
But again, criticisms about the focus.
Yes, Blair's emphasis on league tables and creating specialist schools or academies to offer choice led to accusations that they were neglecting struggling schools in poorer areas, potentially increasing inequality even as overall standards rose. It was that tension again.
What about that pledge on child poverty? Did they make progress there?
They did make significant progress, yes. Policies like the child tax credit are credited with lifting over 1 million children out of relative poverty by 2005. Sure, start centers for preschool children were rolled out. Expanded rights for workers also helped. Polly Toynbee called it social justice by stealth, real improvements for the poorest third, but often downplayed by Blair to avoid scaring middle-class voters or antagonizing the right-wing press, although progress stalled a bit towards the end of the term.
And crime and rights during this period.
On crime, more police officers, the introduction of police community support officers, PCSOs. Official figures showed crime continuing to fall overall, though violent crime did rise. But the prison population hit a record high, over 80,000 by 2007, raising questions about whether they were locking up too many people for minor offenses and not tackling reoffending effectively.
And the anti-terror legislation.
That was highly controversial. The Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act after 9/11, allowing detention without trial for foreign suspects, was challenged in the courts. Later replaced by control orders, which also faced human rights objections. It was a constant balancing act between security and liberty.
But on other rights issues.
Definitely progressive steps. Lowering the age of consent for gay men, finally repealing Section 28, and the big one, the Civil Partnership Act in 2004, giving same-sex couples legal rights similar to marriage. That was a major social reform.
Oh, and the fox hunting ban finally went through, though it was messy and arguably not very effective.
Economically, how are things holding up?
Remarkably well, actually. Despite a global downturn after 9/11, Gordon Brown's cautious management kept inflation and interest rates low, unemployment stayed low, almost full employment, really. The long period of growth continued. But looming issues were starting to surface, like energy security, which led to the unpopular decision to back new nuclear power stations.
And the scandals. They didn't stop, did they? No, unfortunately. David Blunkett had to resign twice from cabinet posts. Stephen Byers, another minister, resigned over accusations related to spin. There were ongoing criticisms about the Blairs accepting free holidays from wealthy friends. And then the really damaging loans for peerages scandal broke.
Where wealthy donors who had loaned money to the party were nominated for peerages.
Exactly. It led to a police investigation, and Blair actually became the first serving prime minister ever to be questioned by police as part of a criminal inquiry. No charges were ultimately brought, but the damage to public trust was significant. It just fed that perception of cronyism and sleaze.
So moving into Blair's final years in office, that 2004 announcement that he wouldn't fight a fourth election seems like a major misstep in hindsight.
It really did turn him into a lame duck PM almost overnight. All the focus shifted to when he would go, who would succeed him. It weakened his authority significantly.
And events kept unfolding. Iraq and Afghanistan were getting worse. Questions about troop equipment.
Yes, those wars continue to cast a long shadow. Then domestically, you had that incredibly dramatic week in July 2005. First, London wins the bid to host the 2012 Olympics, huge celebration.
And the very next day.
The 77 London bombings. Suicide bombers attacking the transport system, killing 52 people. A horrific reminder that Britain was now a major terrorist target. That led directly to more anti-terror laws, including the eventually abandoned plan for compulsory ID cards.
Other issues were bubbling up too. Immigration, pensions.
Yes, immigration became a much bigger political issue, with reports of large numbers arriving particularly from new EU member states, concerns about pressure on services, but also acknowledgments of labor shortages in some sectors. The Morecambe Bay tragedy, where Chinese cocklepickers drowned, highlighted the exploitation side, and the pension crisis deepened, with more final salary schemes closing, often blamed, rightly or wrongly, on Brown's earlier tax changes.
And woven through all of this was that deteriorating relationship between Blair and Brown. Lowe calls it a tragedy.
It really was. These two figures who had been so close, who had engineered New Labour together, Christian socialists with shared goals, their partnership had been incredibly powerful when they worked together. Pretty much unstoppable, Lowe says. But when they were fighting,
It paralyzed the government.
it often seemed to. Terrified the cabinet and poisoned the government into paralysis, or some of the descriptions used. Constant battles over policy, spending levels, Blair generally wanting to spend more, faster. Brown more cautious, the Euro argument, Blair's focus on public service choice, which Brown disliked. It just got worse and worse.
Until Brown and his allies basically forced Blair's hand.
Pretty much. The pressure grew intense for Blair to name a departure date. He finally announced in September 2006 that he'd step down within a year.
And he finally left office in June 2007, one of the longest-serving PMs. But he did have one final significant achievement just before he went.
Yes, fittingly, he saw power sharing finally restored in Northern Ireland, with Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness serving together as first and deputy first ministers. It was a culmination of that long, difficult peace process he'd invested so much in. He got genuine applause in the House of Commons for his role in that. A positive note to end on.
And then Gordon Brown took over, unopposed. So, looking back at the whole decade, the Blair years, how do we assess the legacy? It's incredibly complex. Politically, he achieved what Thatcher did, 3 election wins in a row.
Which is a huge achievement in British politics. Will Hutton's view, quoted by Lowe, is that Blair invented a new strain of British politics, liberal Labour. He dragged the party to the center ground, made it electable, and arguably shifted the entire political spectrum, forcing the Conservatives to accept things like the minimum wage and government responsibility for public services.
But there's a counter-argument.
Yes, people like Ross McKibben argue the modernization under Smith was probably enough, that Labour likely would have won in '97 anyway, and that Blair's further shifts were a systematic betrayal of the party's core values. So, was he a necessary modernizer, or did he abandon Labour's soul? That debate continues.
Socially, though, there seems to be more consensus that Britain became, as Lowe says, a more modern, liberal, and progressive country.
I think that's fair. You saw more women and ethnic minority MPs, definitely greater racial tolerance overall, huge advances in gay and lesbian rights, with civil partnerships being the landmark, and those constitutional changes, devolution for Scotland and Wales, they feel irreversible now. You can't imagine abolishing them. That's a lasting impact.
Economically, Gordon Brown's record as Chancellor is often praised.
Outstanding success is Lowe's assessment of the Brown years managing the economy, low inflation, low interest rates, low unemployment, that record period of sustained growth. Most people did become more prosperous.
But the downside?
The massive buildup of personal debt, that huge consumer boom fueled by easy credit. It left households incredibly exposed, owing, on average, 160% of their income by the end. This vulnerability was brutally exposed by the global credit crunch that hit just as Brown became prime minister. Banks had taken huge risks. Institutions like Northern Rock collapsed. The economy went into recession in 2008 for the first time in 16 years. So the economic legacy is definitely double-edged. Sustained growth, but built on foundations that proved shaky.
On foreign affairs, clearly the most divisive part of the legacy.
Absolutely. Supporters point to positives. Doubling overseas aid, leading the charge on debt relief for Africa at the G8 summit in Glen Eagles. Andrew Roberts praises Blair's guts for standing with America after 9/11.
Well, the critics.
Critics like Polly Toynbee argue the Iraq War was such a catastrophic mistake. It discredited Blair's whole concept of liberal interventionism. It left Britain more isolated from Europe, fueled anti-Americanism, and damaged Britain's standing globally. Those earlier successes in places like Sierra Leone and Kosovo were just forgotten in Baghdad. Iraq dominates the foreign policy legacy, overwhelmingly negatively for most.
And that reputation for spin and sleaze, did that have a lasting effect?
Definitely. The perception that spin doctors like Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson manipulated the media, used dodgy statistics, even told downright lies, it contributed significantly to a decline in public trust in politicians and government across the board. That cynicism is arguably still with us.
Finally, that destructive Blair-Brown rivalry, what was the cost of that?
The consensus view is that it really did weaken the government, wasted energy that could have been spent on policy. Andrew Ronsley's quote sums it up. Two such towering political talents might have accomplished yet more had they spent more time firing together and less time firing at each other. A missed opportunity.
So a really mixed picture. Will Hutton's final verdict, quoted by Lowe, seems quite balanced. Blair could have done so much more and did not need to make the Iraq mistake. But what he did is still substantial. He left his country in better shape than when he found it. He will be a tough act to follow.
It captures that complexity well, I think. Huge achievements alongside huge controversies.
So when we look back at the Labour Party's journey from the shadows of 1979 to the dawn of the Blair era, what really stands out to you? Is it that incredible radical transformation of New Labour itself? Is it the domestic achievements, the minimum wage, devolution, the social changes that maybe quietly reshaped British society more than we realized at the time? Or is it inevitably overshadowed by the profound and deeply controversial impact of foreign policy, especially Iraq?
It's hard to separate them, isn't it? The transformation enabled the domestic achievements, but the foreign policy choices ultimately defined so much of the public memory.
As we pull back from this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider is this. How much of Tony Blair's legacy was about a deliberate strategic reshaping of Britain, a conscious plan? And how much was it simply reacting, sometimes maybe desperately, to the seismic shifts happening in the world around him, globalization, terrorism, the end of the old political certainties?
That interaction between strategy and circumstance is fascinating.
It certainly leaves us with a lot to think about leadership, how political parties change, and just the ripple effects, intended and unintended, of the choices made when you're in power.